Last week I did another talk with Rela on the topic of Battlefield 3, specifically the gunplay. It's obvious that Battlefield 3 has terrible mechanics. There are not any of the wonderful quality of life features Battlefield 1 has, such as the adjustable zoom and customizable reticle and so on. The jets and the helicopters in Battlefield 3 were, of course, obscenely overpowered, and if you basically didn't have a good jet or heli of your own, you should basically just give up. Suppression was as awful as I remember it being, if not worse. 10 Hz tick rate was terrible, to say the least. But with all that aside, I found that the gunplay was extremely fun, for many reasons that we are going to be discussing here. Note that I actually did this talk with Rela the other day, and due to the length of the discussion and the fact that I felt it had a lot of shaft that could be removed, I have snipped up some of the parts and then re-added a voiceover, which I thought would make more sense than the original did. What I'm trying to identify here is why, despite all of these hilariously glaring flaws, why does Battlefield 3 end up being a fun game?
That's a good question, because I think most of the analysis of Battlefield 3 are in terms of feeling. Like when you ask even a competitive player, why did you like Battlefield 3? He's like, I don't know, the weapons felt good. It's like he has a feeling of pleasure when he's killing someone. It's like the bullets are entering the enemy's skin and you are feeling good. You don't understand why.
You know, that's exactly why I went to try out Battlefield 3 last weekend, is because I did not know why people found that Battlefield 3 was an enjoyable game. Before I started playing, I would not have agreed with the statement that Battlefield 3 was fun. I had played it, a month back and a few months before that, and my assessment of the game was not particularly favorable. I didn't find it to be particularly enjoyable. But this time around, I really went back and tried to play Battlefield 3 as Battlefield 3 was supposed to be played. Battlefield 3 had a more defensive playstyle, so I tried to play it, sort of using the styles that were shown to be effective by the competitive players of that era. And I thought it was incredibly fun. Maybe it's just because I've sort of lost interest in Battlefield 1 to some extent. It doesn't quite have the same level of fun that Battlefield 3 does have. And I'm not sure why this is either. Maybe it's indicative of very good and fun core gameplay that is enjoyable despite how hilariously bad almost everything about the game is. The balance is awful, the networking is awful, the UI is pretty bad, there are features that are terrible, yet it still somehow ends up being an enjoyable game. And I suspect it's because that the gunplay is so, well, I'm not sure what it is about it, but it's fun to play. And that is ultimately what the most important aspect of a game is. If a game is extremely well balanced and not fun to play, it's simply not worth playing. If it looks good on a spreadsheet but doesn't play out well, it's not a good game.
I was always wondering when Battlefield 4 came out, where the gameplay was very different. Did the developers understood exactly what they were doing with the gameplay, or did they end up having some very funny gameplay without really knowing how they did? When we entered Battlefield 4, our question was like, can you reproduce Battlefield 3 gunplay? How do we do beside our feeling of pleasure we have in Battlefield 3? We thought many things.
I think some of the best features in games were often unintended features that were not part of the game that the developers had envisioned. Rocket jumping was an exploit as far as the developers were concerned, but because it added so much interest to the game, in some ways it became an official part of what made Quake interesting. Another example that I've brought up in prior videos is in CS 1.6, after you switched or reloaded, your first bullet would be almost perfectly accurate. In some guns, it would be literally perfectly accurate. This was not intended by the developers, and they actually patched it. But due to community demand, which in this case was probably perfectly justified, as this glitch, this exploit, had become an integral part of the way many competitive players played. As CS 1.6 had very large base spread values, this was in some ways needed to make sure that you could get an accurate headshot off. It was a glitch that actually added depth to the game, as it placed extreme importance on the first shot in a burst. Your first shot was going to be much more accurate. And in some ways, this is what inspired the logarithmic model for spread increase that CSGO uses.
I will just add something. It is on Battlefield 3, you had the head glitch problem. So in itself, you could be like, okay, there are head glitches in the game. It's not very good. But in a competitive setup, the head glitch forced you to have a perfect timing with the first bullet's recoil counter. If you were a JK, for example, and you wanted to kill instantly someone behind the head glitch, so you could basically see, I'd say, half of the guy's head, you had to have the perfect first burst timing with lowering your mouse and shooting, which in practice, even in theory, it looks stupid to have head glitch, but in practice, it had added a skill gap because good or average players could not always do it, but very good players could do it consistently, and they won their fights against head glitch people sometimes. I mean, unless the guy was shooting first, so in that case you were suppressed. But I think that Polish games have to be extremely well designed, like perfectly designed, if you want them to be really interesting for all players. I will say Overwatch is a perfectly designed game, and it's very polished at the same time. You feel you can do a lot of things with every character, but at the same time, you're not exploiting something the developers did not, not foreseen. Ikao on Battlefield 3 told me a very interesting story about a game called Guns, which is, I would say, the absolute example of what you're talking about, which is how glitches can be sometimes useful to the gameplay, and how they can bring some skill-based gameplay that is not breaking the experience. It's that game Guns was basically a game with a lot of animations, and players found that if you were breaking the animations in a certain order, you could literally fly. It's like you had to add very high APM, so you had to break that animation by doing that animation, that animation in like 1/2 a second. And the game, it was called the K-style for Korean style because Korean people discovered it. And the game worked very, very well based on this completely broken gameplay. And then the developers were like, oh, okay, but we're going to create Guns 2, and we're going to try to polish the animations so they cannot be broken anymore. And the Guns 2 game was a failure. Like not a lot of people bought it. And it was like a commercial failure because they couldn't find the K-style or the animation breaking gameplay they had before. So that in my opinion, that's like this game is the most important example of not seeing the developer's vision of the game as the only possible one, because it could end up having bad consequences for the developers themselves.
There can be many aspects of a game that were completely unintended and yet add depth and interest, and in some cases can make or break a game in terms of success. The developer's vision is certainly not the only way the game can be played, and by limiting it strictly to the developer's own creativity, you prevent the players from using their creativity to come up with new and interesting ways to play the game that the developers never really intended. I feel like there's nothing to discover in Battlefield 1, and I think that's part of the problem. I think it's too polished in some ways. Older games, such as Battlefield 3, and even going back further, games such as Quake and CS 1.6 had interesting quirks that the players could over time discover and abuse. Things like the AN-94, extreme head glitching, the Zuzu jump, Euro hipfire, and so forth. These were not originally intended to be part of the game by the developers, and yet when they were applied to play, it was found that they added rather than subtracted to the game's play in regards to the competitive level, and even in the casual level. Since it has been months since the launch of Battlefield 1, and not a single person has discovered a very interesting glitch such as the Zuzu jump or the Euro hipfire, and so forth, to play effectively in Battlefield 1, I am beginning to suspect that there simply aren't any major ones, and if they do exist, they won't be relevant enough to affect play like the Zuzu jump and Euro hipfire did. It's too concrete, it's not flexible enough. Games such as Overwatch take a different approach to this. Rather than being buggy as all hell, they simply are very gameplay rich, and each of the characters and the heroes have lots of different ways to be played. There are lots of things to discover about each of the heroes, and as a result they replace some of that unintended feature that games such as CS 1.6, BF3, and BF4 had, with actually intended good gameplay design, which is another way to approach the issue. If you're going to have a system that is so locked down that the players can't discover anything new about the game, they're not going to feel particularly rewarded when they play. And I think this is actually what people are trying to get at when they say that there's no unlocks or progression in the game. It's less about progression and more about things to discover in the game. It's too transparent in Battlefield 1. You can argue that this is good game design. I think that it is not. Over time, people need to be able to discover new and interesting ways to play the game. And as far as I can tell in Battlefield 1, that doesn't seem to exist.
BF1, I mean, movements are very, very good, in my opinion. But in terms of pure skill sailing, the sliding, all these things, they are pretty easy to reproduce if you have some experience in first-person shooters. So you are going to have pretty fast, skill sailing, as you mentioned.
The movement system is, of course, one example of this. There's simply no depth to it. Someone with a basic understanding of first-person shooters can, with little effort, learn to use the crouch slide mechanic and the movement mechanic in Battlefield 1 to play effectively. That's not particularly interesting. It's impossible to feel like you're learning new things about how to play the game when there is either nothing to abuse, like there was in BF3 or BF4, or there's simply nothing to use, like is the case in Overwatch. I think it's stripped too many interesting unintended features out and hasn't added any intended features in, like games, as I've said multiple times, Overwatch. Moving on to gunplay, it's important to consider gunplay not in isolation. The numbers on the guns and the stats of the guns themselves don't completely determine how gunplay will work in a game. It consists of many aspects: tick rate, movement speed, gadgetry. In Battlefield 3, the 10 Hz tick rate plus the lower TTK due to heavy barrel led to primarily a high burst damage defensive playstyle with the fallback of the bunny hopping if you found yourself in a very awkward position. In BF4, the 30 Hz to 60 Hz tick rate plus a higher time to kill due to the lack of H-bar gave us a very offensive, low burst damage, but high damage over time playstyle, consisting mostly of sprays, with lots of Zuzu jumps and a very high-speed way of playing. Whereas Battlefield 3 focused on accuracy and slow play, Battlefield 4 is pretty much entirely all about speed. There is very little emphasis on accuracy in Battlefield 4. The 60 Hz tick rate in Battlefield 1 plus the even higher tick rate than Battlefield 4, plus the awful explosives, gadgetry, and bayonet system means that people tend to avoid using the guns, and you get problems like grenade spam, which is in part caused by the fact that many people feel that their weapons are simply too anemic to do the job effectively.
I think it's a combination of, it's very complex. And as you said, the first problem you have with that is the theory you can have about gunplay doesn't always fit Battlefield 3. You will be like, in theory, the game is bad, but in practice, it's good. Even me, I will have a lot of trouble explaining exactly the mechanics that are producing it. As you say, the spread, the time to kill, all these things. I already wrote something about it. It's a system. It's depending of the recoil, of the movement speed, of the evasive movement possibilities, of the average number of enemies on your screen, of the hitbox size, of even the tick rate. And all these parameters are blended together and added to the gunplay values. So the gunplay values by themselves, they are important, but they are with a lot of other parameters.
This may surprise some of you, but BF3 was surprisingly flexible. I know I've said that it is the microburst game, and that's true to some extent. Microburst is extremely powerful in this game, but other players developed unique play styles as a result of trying to break the mold from that microburst pattern, and they ended up being extremely effective.
I would say Battlefield 3, yes, as you said, the very interesting part was the number of possibilities you had. If you played M16, for example, like many competitive players, to make something personal about the game. As you said on Battlefield, well, for Battlefield 1, there is, I would say, one obvious way to play the game. I mean, every weapon, I mean. And on Battlefield 3, maybe because it was a middle ground, like especially the M16, between many playstyle, you could develop something personal. So you had, of course, the basic, I think Mayek was playing like this. He was using, very short bursts. Zuzu was playing like this also. You had more some kind of JK style, which was, a bit more based on being very accurate with the first bullet. So you could kill the guy instantly in one burst without having to microburst. And you had people like Drungsy, which were like the absolute opposite of JK, who clicked every bullet. Like Drungsy has, or had, I don't know, maybe he got older, but he had an ability to click so fast that he was higher than the M16 RPM. So he was above 800 RPM, which allowed him to have only first bullets when he clicked. So you had basically, I would say, 3 game styles. That created a lot of interest around the gunplay, even if the gunplay was maybe in itself less interesting than other gunplays. But the fact that you could do so much different personal interpretations of the gunplay meant that you always felt you could discover something. And I was, at the start, like everyone, I was like, oh my god, so Drungsy is clicking fast, I'm gonna have to click fast. Then I discovered JK, who himself tried to create the JK style as a way to distinguish himself from Drungsy or other people like this, and he understood that it actually had potential in esports, so he tryharded it, etc. I would say it's maybe the middle ground of a weapon like the M16 that could allow different interpretations of how to play.
It's true that in Battlefield 1, most of the guns are more strictly limited based on range. Now, you can technically engage outside of that range if you are effective enough and if you are good enough. We'll get back to that skill ceiling issue in a little bit. In other words, you can effectively use a close quarters weapon at a variety of ranges like you could in Battlefield 3. There are some exceptions to this.
Like one of the weapons without such a low ceiling is the shotgun. The ceiling is actually too high, and you're not going to be able to hit most of your shots, like against a guy strafing in any direction. But it's the opposite problem. The ceiling is very high, which is already better. It feels better because you feel in every kill that you could improve, unlike a few other weapons in the game.
The simple fact of the matter is that if we continue to hold to this pattern of a more strict limitation to engagement distance, we simply need more weapons like snipers and slug shotguns. Weapons that are entirely dependent on mechanical skill to influence a large amount of players at a variety of ranges. Now, that large amount of players is key in a game that is not a 1v1 game. The Model 8 works, of course, at basically any range that you'd want to engage at, but only at 1 target, 2 targets if you're extremely effective. It's not good at holding off a large amount of players. And as a 32 to 64 player game, there will always be a lot of players on the map. But at the same time, letting close quarters weapons beat long range weapons at a majority of distances is obviously bad balance. So how do we not give ourselves AEK the game? I'm not sure. I'm not a gameplay designer. But I can tell you that I found that Battlefield 3, with its awful, terrible, horrendous balance, and even Hardline, have been more fun to play than I have ever found Battlefield 1 to be. Take from that what you will. One solution possibly is Battlefield 3 with some minor horizontal recoil tweaks to make, the Scar L not have more horizontal than the M16. There are some very obvious changes to make to Battlefield 3 that would let it approach balance, if not actually attain it. Possibly Battlefield 3 with the same heavy barrel min spread, very good min spread, but spread increased first shot multiplier, making JK style more effective and just pure blind microbursting a bit less effective. That's also an option. Of course, the jets and the helicopters would need some drastic changes because they are extremely cancerous in Battlefield 3. As I've demonstrated to myself by the fact that I found Battlefield 3 more fun and pre-patch Battlefield Hardline more fun than Battlefield 1, it has made me realize that I would rather have a fun game over a balanced game. Hardline was fun initially, at least, because it had a very short time to kill. After the K-10 was nerfed, I think that was the perfect spot for Hardline to be in. Yes, the balance was awful, but it wasn't going to get any better anyway. And then they increased the time to kill, making the standard ARs a 5-hit kill in close range and something like a 7-hit kill at range. This was definitely not a good idea. It ruined all the magic that I felt Hardline had. And we were left with a game that was not any better balanced, but it was much less fun. So that's what kind of destroyed Hardline for me. I know that you played Hardline at the start, did you not?
Yeah, I did. We played it. I played the beta, and then we had the DreamHack, French DreamHack on the Hardline. We went third. We lost against Fnatic. We got fucking raped, and then we won against ASK or something. That's what we did. And then we stopped the game. We uninstalled it. If you take only the M16 gunplay, yeah, for the same reason, the M16 on BF3 was enjoyable. Sorry, you can deal with multi-target situations pretty effectively because you have the extended magazine, if I'm not mistaken.
It was less about the extended mag and more about the 28 max damage with 31 rounds at 800 RPM with a very good heavy barrel.
Yeah, I think most of the players on BF1 when the beta came out felt powerless because in most situations they could not use their skill to change the situation. Even they could not go over their range, as you said. So the only almost completely the only weapon with which you felt safe, you felt you could do something in every situation was the sniper, and still is, I will say, or maybe the Model 8 also, because whatever is coming in front of you, even if it's not your range, you can do something. While on Battlefield 1, with the other weapon for most of the ranges, you just can't do something. You're feeling like whatever you are as a player, it doesn't matter. It's not the range. So yeah, as you say, the fact that a close range weapon or a very long range weapon can extend their range to close range or long range is very interesting, because that's where the skill gap is going to be usually. Actually, like if you are playing a close range sniper and you destroy everyone, well, you are very likely to be a skilled player, because you're able to be effective outside of your correct range with the sniper. And if you are very good at middle or long range with the M16 or anything else, well, you also are probably a very accurate and skilled player, I'll say.
Now, here's the thing. I'd say that positioning is a skill, and it's an important skill to have. But I think that Battlefield 1 goes a bit too far in regards to determining whether or not you succeed or fail in engagement based on your distance from the target. Part of the glorious farming of Battlefield 3 was that I could basically kill anyone on the map at any range, provided my weapon control was on point. Again, going back to the topic of, is it worth having another close-range meta game? And I'd say that if I had to choose between Battlefield 3 gunplay and Battlefield 1 gunplay, I'd probably choose Battlefield 3's gunplay, terrible as it was, every single time.
Gunplay values are attempts to invite to certain gameplays or to inhibit other gameplays. It's always an attempt to force players into some gameplay, into some ways. And of course, since it's only an attempt, since there is no logical link between a certain gunplay value and a certain gameplay, it can backfire. And like a very good example, which is from a more legitimate game, which is CS:GO, is how like a theoretically perfect gameplay will be the headshot only gameplay, the scream gameplay. And in a theory interview, NBK was talking about Scream, the player, and he said that even if Scream indeed has that absolutely perfect headshot with a very low ratio, with a very low fail ratio, on the long run, he's going to be less effective than a guy spraying or having a more, I would say, classic gameplay with the spray following the attempt to headshot. That's just my point on practical parameters being so that they can counter a theoretical gameplay based only on the gun's value. Because of course, if you headshot everybody, you're going to kill everybody. But on the human limitations, So the practical parameters make a headshot gameplay like Stream, if you follow NBK's theory, less effective on the long run than a guy that would hit more often the players, even though if he's not literally destroying them sometimes. So I think that was a good example, even though we cannot exactly implement it with the BF4. So yeah, if I can just like, in BF4, a close example will be the AOK spray, because in competitive setups, what we ended up doing with the AOK was usually spraying, only spraying. So even though the gun values, the AOK spread reset value will suggest a very subtle, or not very subtle, spread control behavior, it led to the opposite, because this spray control behavior was too complicated to do perfectly every time. So players on the long run were right to only spray. So that attempt to burst led players to only spray, if I make sense.
You know, that makes me think of the head hitbox size reduction. In Battlefield 1, it was reduced in size drastically from Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 3. Considering just how high the movement speed and acceleration is in Battlefield 1, I think the head hitboxes could actually be brought up in size to a cross-section skilled humans can actually hit in a reasonable manner. You see, the problem with Battlefield 1's headshot mechanics is that it's a risk-reward payout. There's a reward if you aim consistent headshots, but the problem is that the risk is so high and the time investment needed to be able to become reasonably successful in regards to hitting headshots is simply too high for even the best players to consider. There's this horseshoe theory of skilled game mechanics. There's a point at which a game with an unreachable skill ceiling becomes as little defined by skill as a game that was completely designed to be totally casual. If it takes such a ridiculous amount of time and effort and almost superhuman reflexes to reach a point where your skills actually pay off and you get a reward, it's really pretty hard to discern that from a game with a very low skill ceiling in the first place. Again, it's about risk, reward. Currently, there's very little payout for a risky head-only or accurate playstyle, so it's simply not worth the investment. This video has gone on long enough, so I will stop it there.
He was toggling because I really could not tell.